The leather menu felt heavy in my trembling hands as Marcus's laughter echoed across the pristine dining room of Lumière, cutting through the soft murmur of conversation and clinking crystal. His voice carried that particular brand of cruelty that only comes from someone who knows exactly where to aim the knife. "Seriously, Mom," he said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "What made you think you could afford a place like this? Did you see the prices? The cheapest entrée is more than your monthly grocery budget." The words hit like ice water, and I felt my cheeks burn under the gentle glow of the restaurant's chandeliers. Around us, other diners tried to pretend they weren't listening, but I caught the sideways glances, the uncomfortable shifts in their seats. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 62, I thought I'd earn the right to take my family out for a nice dinner without being made to feel like a charity case. I'd been planning this evening for weeks, ever since Marcus called to tell me about his promotion at the law firm. My son, the lawyer. I'd been so proud when he'd passed the bar, when he'd landed his first job at Henderson & Associates, when he'd married Victoria and moved into that beautiful house in Westchester. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for me to show him how proud I was, how far we'd both come. I should have known better. I should have remembered how he'd changed over the years, how success had hardened him in ways I never anticipated. But hope is a stubborn thing, and I'd clung to the memory of the little boy who used to help me count change at the grocery store, who understood why we bought generic cereal and waited for sales on chicken. The hostess had seated us at a prime table by the window, where the city lights twinkled like fallen stars beyond the glass. Lumière was everything I'd imagined when I'd made the reservation 3 weeks ago, scraping together money I probably shouldn't have spent. The walls were cream silk, the floors polished marble, and every surface seemed to gleam with the kind of understated luxury that whispered, rather than shouted, its expense. I'd worn my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for Marcus's wedding 5 years ago, and I'd even splurged on getting my graying hair styled at the salon down the street from my apartment. Marcus had arrived 20 minutes late, striding through the restaurant in his charcoal suit like he owned the place. Victoria wasn't with him. She had a headache, he'd explained with a dismissive wave. Or maybe she just didn't want to watch what was about to unfold. My daughter-in-law had always been polite to me, but there was a distance there. A careful politeness that never quite warmed into genuine affection. "Mom, you realize this place has a dress code, right?" had been his opening comment as he settled into his chair, eyeing my dress with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for court documents. "I mean, it's fine, but just so you know for next time." I'd smiled and ignored the sting, the way I'd learned to do over the years. This was his night, his celebration. I could absorb a little discomfort if it meant spending time with my son, if it meant showing him that I believed in him, that I wanted to honor his success. The server, a young man with kind eyes and careful manners, had approached our table with practiced grace. "Good evening, I'm James, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with something to drink?" Marcus had ordered a bottle of wine without consulting me, something with a French name I couldn't pronounce, and a price tag that probably exceeded my monthly electric bill. When James had poured the wine and asked if we were ready to order, I'd barely opened my menu when Marcus had launched into his commentary. "Take your time, Mom," he'd said, but his tone suggested the opposite. "I know this isn't exactly your usual pizza place." He'd turned to James with a conspiratorial smile. "My mother's treating tonight, so we might need to steer toward the more reasonably priced options." The server had maintained his professional composure, but I'd caught the flicker of something in his expression. Embarrassment, maybe. Not for himself, but for me. That small kindness from a stranger had somehow made Marcus's words cut deeper. I'd tried to study the menu, but the prices swam before my eyes. $48 for the salmon, $55 for the lamb, $38 for a pasta dish. I'd done the math in my head the way I'd been doing math my whole life, calculating and recalculating, trying to figure out how to make it work. My savings account, already depleted from helping Marcus with his bar exam fees years ago, could handle it. Barely. But it would mean ramen noodles for the rest of the month, maybe skipping a few meals entirely. "You know what?" Marcus had continued, apparently warming to his theme. "Maybe we should just split an appetizer, keep it simple." I don't want you blowing your whole Social Security check on one meal." His laugh had followed, that bright, sharp sound that used to delight me when he was small but now felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. The couple at the table next to us had stopped their conversation entirely, and I'd felt their eyes on me like physical weights. An older woman across the dining room had looked up from her soup, her expression shifting from curiosity to something that might have been pity. The man with her had leaned forward and whispered something that made her shake her head sadly. I'd closed the menu and set it down carefully, my hands steadier than I felt. "Marcus, I asked you to dinner to celebrate your promotion. Let me worry about what I can and can't afford." But he'd just grinned, apparently oblivious to the tension he was creating, or perhaps enjoying it. "Mom, come on. You work at a grocery store. You live in a studio apartment. I'm just trying to be practical here. There's no shame in knowing your limitations." The words had hung in the air between us like smoke, poisonous and choking. I'd felt something crack inside my chest, some protective shell I'd built around my heart where I stored all my small hopes and quiet dreams. This wasn't about money, not really. This was about respect, about dignity, about whether my own son saw me as a person worth celebrating or just an embarrassment he had to manage. James had returned then, his pen poised over his notepad, and the silence at our table had stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone within earshot. I'd opened my mouth to order something, anything, just to break the tension, when Marcus had held up a hand. Actually, he'd said to James, his voice carrying that lawyer's confidence he'd perfected over the years, "Could you give us a few more minutes? My mother's still trying to figure out what she can afford." Another laugh, brighter this time, as if he'd made a particularly clever joke. That's when I'd felt it, the heat creeping up my neck, the familiar burn of humiliation that I'd thought I'd left behind in childhood, back when other kids would make fun of my secondhand clothes and my mother's broken English. But this was worse somehow. This was my own son, the person I'd sacrificed everything for, the reason I'd worked double shifts and skipped meals and worn shoes with holes in them until I could afford new ones. I'd looked around the restaurant then, really looked, taking in the faces of the other diners. Some were carefully avoiding eye contact, studying their wine glasses or their phones with sudden fascination. Others were watching with the kind of morbid curiosity people reserve for accidents and public arguments. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, whispering to their companions. And that's when I'd noticed him, the man at the corner table, sitting alone with what looked like business papers spread in front of him. He was probably in his 50s, with silver-threaded dark hair and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. But he wasn't smiling now.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Was watching our table with an expression I couldn't quite read, his pen frozen halfway to the document in front of him. Marcus had been oblivious, of course, too caught up in his own performance to notice anything else. He'd turned back to me with that same infuriating grin. "So what's it going to be, Mom?" "The chicken's only $36. Very reasonable for a place like this." I'd wanted to stand up then. I'd wanted to walk out, to save myself the further humiliation that I could feel building like storm clouds on the horizon. But I'd stayed frozen in my chair, caught between my desire to flee and my stubborn determination not to let him win, not to let him reduce me to the small, powerless person he apparently saw when he looked at me. The man at the corner table had set down his pen entirely now. He'd been watching us, yes, but there was something different in his attention, something that didn't feel like the voyeuristic curiosity of the other diners. He'd looked almost protective, concerned, as if what he was witnessing genuinely troubled him. James had hovered nearby, professional enough not to interrupt, but clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding at his table. I'd caught his eye and tried to smile, to let him know that this wasn't his fault, that he didn't need to fix whatever was broken between my son and me. "I'll have the salmon," I'd said finally, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "And Marcus will have whatever he'd like." Marcus had raised his eyebrows. "Are you sure about that, Mom?" "The salmon's almost $50. "I'm sure." "Okay, but don't come crying to me when your rent's due and you're short." He'd turned to James. "I'll have the ribeye, medium rare. And could we get some bread to start?" All this talking is making me hungry. That's when it had happened. The moment that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. The man at the corner table had stood up, smoothed down his tie, and started walking toward us. Not quickly, not with any obvious urgency, but with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he'd made a decision and intended to follow through with it. He'd stopped at our table, his presence somehow commanding attention without demanding it. "Excuse me," he'd said, his voice warm but carrying an authority that made both Marcus and James look up. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing." Marcus had looked annoyed at the intrusion. "I'm sorry, do we know you?" The man had smiled then, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Not exactly, but I know Elena." The sound of my own name had sent a shock through me. I'd stared up at this stranger, this man who somehow knew who I was, and felt the bottom drop out of my understanding of the evening. "I'm sorry," I'd said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't think we've met." His smile had grown warmer then, more genuine. "We haven't met in person, but I know who you are. You're Elena Rodriguez. You work at Martinez Market on 5th Street. My heart had started beating faster. Martinez Market was the grocery store where I'd been working for the past 8 years, ever since the department store where I'd been a saleswoman had closed down. It was honest work, good work. But it wasn't the kind of job that usually brought recognition or fame. I'd nodded slowly, still confused but beginning to sense that something significant was happening. Marcus had looked between us with growing irritation. "Okay, great, you shop at the same grocery store. Can we get back to our dinner now?" But the man had ignored him completely, his attention focused entirely on me. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you probably don't remember this, but about 6 months ago you helped my daughter. She came into your store late one evening, just before closing. She was crying, upset about something that had happened at school." The memory had hit me like a wave. A young girl, maybe 16, with tear-streaked cheeks and shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She'd been in the cereal aisle, of all places, standing there like she was lost. I'd approached her carefully, the way you approach a wounded animal, and asked if she needed help. She said you sat with her for 20 minutes after your shift ended. The man had continued. "You listened while she told you about kids at school who were making fun of her because her family didn't have much money. About how embarrassed she was to use food stamps, how ashamed she felt when other kids saw her mother counting out change at the register." I'd remembered more now. The girl's name was Sophia. She'd been worried about starting her junior year, afraid that the other kids would continue to mock her family's financial situation. I'd told her about my own experiences, about how I'd learned that there was no shame in doing what you had to do to take care of your family. "You told her," the man had continued, his voice growing stronger, more emotional, "that dignity comes from how you treat others, not from how much money you have. You said that anyone who would make fun of someone for their family's financial situation wasn't worth worrying about." The restaurant had grown quieter around us. Other diners were openly watching now, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding at our table. James had stepped back slightly, giving us space but remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Marcus had been shifting in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Look, that's very nice, but we're trying to have a family dinner here." The man had finally looked at Marcus then, and I'd seen something flash in his expression. Something cold and measuring. "Yes, I can see that. A family dinner where you're humiliating your mother in public, making jokes about her financial situation loud enough for half the restaurant to hear." "Now wait just a minute," Marcus had started, his voice taking on that aggressive tone he used in court. But the man had held up a hand, the same gesture Marcus had used on me earlier, except when this stranger did it, it carried real authority. "I'm not finished. Mrs. Rodriguez, after my daughter told me about your kindness, I did some research. I learned that you've been working at Martinez Market for 8 years. That before that, you worked at Hartwell Department Store for 12 years before they closed. That you raised your son as a single mother, working 2 jobs most of the time to make sure he had everything he needed." Each fact had landed like a small explosion in my chest. How did this man know so much about my life, and why did hearing my own history recited back to me make me feel simultaneously proud and vulnerable. I learned, he'd continued, that you put yourself through night school to get your high school diploma when your son was in elementary school. That you took out loans you're probably still paying off to help him through college and law school. That you've never asked him for a penny back, never made him feel guilty about the sacrifices you made. Marcus's face had gone pale. He'd looked around the restaurant as if searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped in this moment, in this public reckoning that he'd created and now couldn't control. You also learned, the man had said, turning back to me, that every Christmas for the past 5 years, you've anonymously donated food baskets to families in need. That you volunteer at the community center on weekends, helping kids with their homework. That when Mrs. Chen from your building had surgery last year, you brought her dinner every night for 2 weeks. I'd felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. These weren't things I advertised, weren't things I expected recognition for. They were just life. The things you do because they need doing, because you have the ability to help and someone else needs help. The man had reached into his jacket pocket then and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully on the table in front of me. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm David Chen. I own this restaurant. The words had hit like thunder. David Chen, Mrs. Chen's son. The successful businessman she'd talked about with such pride, the one who'd moved to the city and made something of himself. The son who'd flown in from Seattle when she'd had her surgery, who'd sat by her hospital bed for days. Your kindness to my mother, he'd continued, and to my daughter, and apparently to half the neighborhood, is why you'll never pay for a meal in my restaurant. It's why I'm about to ask my staff to bring you our finest bottle of champagne and our chef's special tasting menu. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the soft background music seemed muted. I'd looked around and seen faces turned toward us, expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration to something that looked like approval. Marcus had found his voice finally. Look, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. David Chen had turned to him with the kind of look that could freeze flame. Oh, there's been a misunderstanding, all right. You've misunderstood who your mother is. You've misunderstood what she's worth. And you've definitely misunderstood what kind of man you are when you talk to her the way you've been talking to her tonight. You don't know anything about our family. Marcus had shot back, but his voice had lacked its earlier confidence. I know enough, David had replied calmly. I know that your mother worked 16-hour days to put you through school. I know that she's respected and loved by everyone who knows her. And I know that the way you've been treating her tonight says a lot more about your character than it does about your bank account. James had appeared at David's shoulder then, along with what looked like the restaurant's sommelier and another server I didn't recognize. They'd moved with the kind of synchronized precision that suggested this wasn't entirely spontaneous. Mrs. Rodriguez, David had said, I'd like to invite you to be my guest this evening. James will take care of everything. Please, order anything you'd like. Everything is on the house. The gesture had been overwhelming, beautiful, and completely unexpected. But it had also created a problem. Marcus was still my son, still the person I'd come here to celebrate. I'd looked at him, sitting there with his face flushed and his jaw tight, and seen not the successful lawyer he'd become but the little boy who'd once been so proud to walk beside me to the corner store. That's very generous, I'd said carefully, but I came here to take my son to dinner, to celebrate his promotion. David had nodded, understanding immediately. Of course, the invitation extends to your entire party. Marcus had looked like he wanted to refuse, to stand up and storm out. His pride was clearly wounded, his attempt to diminish me having backfired spectacularly. But he was also a lawyer, practical enough to know that walking away from a free meal at one of the city's most expensive restaurants would only make him look more foolish. Fine, he'd said stiffly. Thank you. David had smiled then, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him all evening. Wonderful. James, please bring Mrs. Rodriguez and her son our tasting menu, and the champagne I mentioned. As the staff had dispersed to fulfill his instructions, David had lingered for a moment longer. Mrs. Rodriguez, my mother talks about you all the time. She says you're the kind of person who makes the world better just by being in it. I'd felt the tears threatening again. Your mother is very kind. She's also very wise, he'd said. And so, apparently, are you. He'd glanced at Marcus, not unkindly but with unmistakable meaning. I hope your son realizes how lucky he is. With that, he'd returned to his corner table, leaving Marcus and me alone with the wreckage of our evening. The other diners had gradually returned to their own conversations, though I'd still caught occasional glances in our direction. James had returned with the champagne, presenting it with ceremony and pouring it into crystal flutes that caught the light like liquid diamonds. The first course had arrived shortly after. Delicate amuse-bouches that were almost too beautiful to eat. Marcus had eaten in silence, his earlier bravado completely deflated. I'd tried to restart the conversation several times, to return to the celebration I'd originally planned, but his responses had been monosyllabic, defensive. The food is incredible, I'd offered. Yeah. The restaurant is beautiful. I'm really proud of your promotion, you know. He'd looked up at me then, and for just a moment, I'd seen something vulnerable in his expression. Something that reminded me of the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Are you? He'd asked quietly. Of course I am. Marcus, you're a successful lawyer. You have a beautiful home, a good marriage. You've achieved everything you worked so hard for. He'd set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. Then why does it feel like it's never enough? Why does it feel like no matter what I accomplish, I'm still just the kid whose mom counted out food stamps at the grocery store? The honesty in his voice had caught me off guard. This wasn't the arrogant son who'd been performing for the restaurant earlier. This was something deeper, more real. Marcus, I'd said gently, there was never anything wrong with food stamps. There was never anything wrong with doing what we had to do to get by. Easy for you to say, he'd replied, but without the venom from earlier. You didn't have to hear the other kids talk. You didn't have to pretend you weren't hungry when there wasn't enough dinner to go around. My heart had broken a little then. I'd thought I'd shielded him from the worst of our struggles, but apparently I'd been naive. Children notice everything, even when we think we're protecting them. I'm sorry, I'd said. I never wanted you to feel ashamed. I wasn't ashamed of you, he'd said quickly. I was ashamed of everything else. Our apartment, our car, the way other parents looked at us at school events. I wanted to be different. I wanted to be someone who belonged in places like this. The second course had arrived then, interrupting our conversation but not the emotional current flowing between us. As we'd eaten, I'd begun to understand something I'd never fully grasped before. Marcus's cruelty earlier hadn't been about money or status. Not really. It had been about fear. Fear that no matter how successful he became, he'd always be that embarrassed kid, afraid of being found out, afraid of not belonging. You do belong here, I'd told him as James had cleared our plates. You've earned your place. But Marcus, you don't have to tear me down to build yourself up. My struggles don't diminish your success. They're part of what made it possible. He'd nodded slowly, and I'd seen tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I know. Sometimes when I look at you, I remember how hard everything was. And I guess I blamed you for that, even though it wasn't your fault. The admission had been painful but necessary, like lancing a wound that had been festering for years. We'd sat in silence for a while, letting the truth settle between us. David Chen had appeared at our table again as we'd been finishing the final course. A dessert so elaborate it looked like architecture. How was everything? Perfect, I'd said, and meant it. Not just the food, though that had been extraordinary, but the entire evening. The confrontation, the revelation, the conversation that had followed. I'm glad to hear it. He'd turned to Marcus. I hope you'll both come back soon. And sir, if I may, your mother is a remarkable woman. I hope tonight helped you see that. Marcus had stood then, extending his hand. It did. And thank you. For the dinner, and for everything else. David had shaken his hand, and I'd seen something pass between them. Understanding, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. As we'd prepared to leave, I'd noticed that several other diners had smiled at me, nodding as I'd passed their tables. Word of what had happened had clearly spread through the restaurant, and I'd felt not embarrassment but something like pride. Outside, the city air had been crisp and clean, washing away the last of the evening's tension. Marcus had walked me to the subway station, something he hadn't done in years. "Mom," he'd said as we'd reached the entrance, "I'm sorry for tonight and for a lot of other things, too." "I know," I'd said. "And Marcus, I'm proud of you not just for your success but for being able to admit when you're wrong. That takes courage." He'd hugged me then, really hugged me, for the first time in longer than I could remember. And standing there on the sidewalk, surrounded by the noise and bustle of the city, I had felt something shift, not just between us, but within myself. I was Elena Rodriguez. I worked at a grocery store and lived in a studio apartment, and sometimes I couldn't afford the things I wanted. But I was also a woman who'd raised a son alone, who'd built a life through determination and hard work, who'd earned the respect and love of her community through simple acts of kindness. That was worth celebrating. That was worth more than any expensive meal. The next morning I'd woken to find a text message from Marcus. "Thank you for dinner last night. I love you, Mom." And attached to the message was a photo of a reservation confirmation for the following month for brunch at Lumière. Just the two of us. But this time, he was treating. As I'd gotten ready for work that morning, I'd thought about David Chen's words, about the dignity that comes from how you treat others, rather than how much money you have. I'd thought about his daughter Sophia, about Mrs. Chen, about all the small moments of connection that make up a life. When I'd arrived at Martinez Market that morning, Mr. Martinez himself had greeted me with a smile. "Elena, I heard you had quite an evening last night. News travels fast in our neighborhood, apparently." I just smiled and tied on my apron, ready for another day of helping customers, of being part of the quiet network of care and support that keeps communities running. But as I'd started my shift, I'd carried with me the memory of the previous evening, the moment when a stranger had stood up for me, when my worth had been recognized and celebrated, when my son had finally seen me clearly. Some victories are small and private, others unfold in public, in restaurants full of witnesses, in moments that change not just how others see you but how you see yourself. That night at Lumière had been both. And I would carry it with me, a reminder that respect and dignity aren't things you can buy with money or status. They're things you earn through how you live, how you treat others, and how you stand up for what's right. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The morning after the dinner at Lumière, I woke before my alarm, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of my studio apartment. For a moment I lay still, letting the memories of the previous evening wash over me like warm water. David Chen's voice echoing through the restaurant. The look on Marcus's face when he realized who the stranger was. The taste of champagne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But more than that, I remembered the feeling. The sensation of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood my worth not through the lens of pity or charity, but through genuine recognition of who I was and what I'd done with my life. It was a feeling I wanted to hold on to examine in the quiet of my morning routine. The apartment felt different somehow. The same cramped space, the same secondhand furniture, the same small kitchen where I'd learned to make miracles happen with whatever ingredients I could afford. But now it felt less like a limitation and more like proof of resilience. These walls had witnessed my struggles, yes, but they'd also sheltered my victories. Every night I'd come home exhausted from double shifts. Every morning I'd gotten up to do it again. Every small triumph and quiet moment of joy. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting my thoughts. A text from Marcus, sent just minutes earlier. "Good morning, Mom. I know it's early, but I couldn't sleep. Can we talk today?" I stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to respond. The Marcus who had humiliated me at dinner felt like a different person from the one who had hugged me on the sidewalk, who had apologized with tears in his eyes. Which one would show up if we met today? Which one was real? Before I could second-guess myself, I typed back, "Of course, come by the store during my lunch break, 1 p.m. His response came immediately, "I'll be there." The Martinez Market was unusually busy for a Thursday morning, filled with the kind of steady stream of customers that kept me moving from register to stocking shelves to helping elderly customers reach items on high shelves. Mrs. Patterson from 2 blocks over stopped by for her usual weekly shopping, and I helped her load her cart while she told me about her grandson's baseball game. Mr. Kowalski picked up ingredients for the pierogi he made every Friday for the senior center, and I made sure to set aside the good sour cream for him. These were the rhythms of my days, the small connections that made work feel less like labor and more like community. I'd never thought of my job as particularly meaningful, certainly not compared to Marcus's legal career or Victoria's work in marketing. But watching Mr. Kowalski's face light up when I remembered his Friday routine, seeing Mrs. Patterson's relief when I offered to carry her groceries to her car, I began to understand what David Chen had seen. Around 11, Sophia Chen walked through the automatic doors, her backpack slung over one shoulder and that hesitant smile I remembered from our first meeting. She was taller now, more confident, her school uniform neat, and her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The scared, crying girl from 6 months ago had grown into someone who carried herself with quiet dignity. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, approaching my register with a small wave. "My dad told me what happened last night." I felt my cheeks warm. "Your father was very kind?" She shook her head, more emphatic than her years would suggest. "No, he was right. He told me what your son said to you, and I just wanted you to know that what you told me that day, about dignity coming from how you treat people, that stayed with me every single day since." The words caught me off guard. I'd thought of our conversation as a small moment, a brief connection between two people who happened to cross paths. But here was proof that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples. "How are things at school?" I asked, genuinely curious. Sophia's smile grew brighter. "Better, much better. I joined the debate team, and I made some real friends. Kids who care about the same things I care about. And when someone makes a comment about money or clothes or whatever, I just remember what you said. Their opinion says more about them than it does about me." Before I could respond, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I brought you something. My dad wanted to send flowers or champagne or something fancy, but I thought you might like this better." I unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small photo in a simple frame. It was a picture of the community center where I volunteered, taken during the holiday party we'd thrown for the kids last December. In the photo, I was helping a little girl hang ornaments on the tree, both of us laughing at something she'd said. "I was there that day," Sophia explained. "My mom volunteers too, helping with the older kids' homework group. You probably didn't notice me, but I saw you with the little ones. You made that girl feel so special, like she was the most important person in the room." Looking at the photo, I could almost hear the laughter, smell the hot chocolate and cookies we'd served, feel the warmth of that December afternoon when a room full of kids had forgotten about everything but the joy of the moment. I'd treasured that day, but I'd never thought of it as anything worth documenting. "Sophia, this is beautiful. Thank you." She hugged me then, quick and fierce, before stepping back with slightly pink cheeks. "My dad says you're coming back to the restaurant soon. I hope I get to see you there. Maybe you can meet my mom properly this time." After she left, I tucked the photo behind the register where I could see it throughout the day. Every time a difficult customer snapped at me, or my feet started to ache from standing, I'd glance at it and remember. This was what David Chen had seen. This was what Marcus had failed to understand. The work I did, the life I'd built, the connections I'd made, they all mattered. At exactly 1 o'clock, Marcus walked through the doors of Martinez Market. He looked different in daylight, without the armor of his expensive suit and the dim lighting of Lumière to soften the edges of his anxiety. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, and his usually perfect hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. I clocked out for lunch and led him to the small break room in the back. A windowless space with a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a humming refrigerator covered in employee notices and photos of coworkers, grandchildren. It wasn't much, but it was private, and right now that's what we needed. Marcus sat across from me, his hands folded on the table, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up and met my eyes. "I talked to Victoria this morning," he said quietly. "About last night. About everything." I waited, sensing there was more. "She said she's been waiting for years for me to have this conversation with you. She said she's watched me treat you badly and wanted to say something, but she didn't think it was her place." He paused, his jaw working. "She was wrong. It was her place. It should have been everyone's place to call me out on how I was acting." The admission surprised me. I'd always assumed Victoria simply tolerated my presence in Marcus's life, that she saw me as an obligation rather than family. "She cares about you more than I realized," Marcus continued. "She told me about the Christmas presents you send to her nieces, how you always remember their birthdays. She said you've never once made her feel like she wasn't good enough for me, even though her family has money and yours doesn't." I thought about Victoria, about the careful politeness I'd interpreted as distance. Maybe what I'd seen as coolness had actually been respect for boundaries, an attempt not to overstep in a relationship that was complicated by years of hurt feelings and unspoken resentments. "She sounds like a wise woman," I said. Marcus nodded. "She is. And she's angry with me, really angry. She said that watching me humiliate you last night was one of the most disgusting things she'd ever seen, and if I didn't figure out how to fix this, she wasn't sure she could stay married to someone who would treat his own mother that way." The words hung heavy in the small room. I could see the fear in Marcus's eyes, the realization that his cruelty might cost him more than just our relationship. "Marcus," I said gently, "I don't want your marriage to suffer because of problems between you and me." "But that's just it," he said, leaning forward earnestly. "They're not separate problems. Victoria married me thinking I was a good man, someone who valued family and treated people with respect. Last night she saw who I really was, and it scared her." He stood up abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Do you know what she said to me this morning? She said that the way a man treats his mother is the way he'll eventually treat his wife. She said she was looking at our future, and she didn't like what she saw." The pain in his voice was real, and despite everything, my heart ached for him. This was still my son, the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been so proud of when he'd passed the bar exam. But he was also a man who needed to face the consequences of his choices, who needed to understand that respect and love couldn't be taken for granted. "What do you want me to say, Marcus?" He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. "I want you to help me understand how we got here. I want to know when I became the kind of person who would humiliate his own mother in public. Because that's not who I thought I was." It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about myself. When had the sweet, sensitive boy who used to bring me dandelions from the schoolyard turned into someone who could be so casually cruel? "I think," I said slowly, "it started when you began to see our struggles as something shameful instead of something we survived together." Marcus sat back down, his attention focused entirely on me. "When you were little, we were a team. You understood that we didn't have much money, but you also understood that we had each other. You were proud of the ways we made things work. Remember when you were 8 and you helped me figure out how to make your Halloween costume out of things we already had?" A small smile crossed his face. "The robot costume. Cardboard boxes and aluminum foil. You loved that costume. You told everyone at school that your mom was the smartest person in the world because she could make anything out of nothing." The smile faded. I remember. But somewhere along the way, that pride turned into shame. You started seeing our resourcefulness as evidence of failure, instead of evidence of strength. You began to believe that having less money meant being worth less as people. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing. "It was high school," he said finally. "When I started really noticing what other kids had. The cars their parents drove to pick them up, the vacations they talked about, the clothes they wore." I nodded. I'd watched it happen, the gradual shift from contentment to comparison, from gratitude to resentment. I'd tried to shield him from it, but teenage social dynamics are powerful forces. "And then college was worse," he continued. "Everyone talking about their trust funds and their parents' careers. I started lying about what you did for work. I told people you were in retail management instead of saying you worked at a grocery store. The confession stung, but I wasn't entirely surprised. I'd suspected as much when he'd stopped bringing friends home, when he'd become vague about his family background in conversations. The worst part, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly, is that I knew I was being unfair. I knew you were working yourself to the bone for me, but instead of being grateful, I was angry. Angry that I had to work harder than other kids just to have the basics. Angry that I couldn't take anything for granted. So you took your anger out on me. Yeah, because you were safe. Because I knew that no matter how badly I treated you, you'd still love me. You'd still be there. The honesty was painful, but necessary. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of years of unspoken resentment settling between us like dust. The thing is, I said eventually, I was proud of that anger sometimes. It drove you to work hard, to succeed, to build something better for yourself. I just wish you hadn't decided that building something better meant tearing down where you came from. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I don't know how to undo years of being awful to you. You start by stopping, I said simply. You start by remembering that my struggles don't diminish your success. They made it possible. But what if it's too late? What if I've damaged things too badly? I looked around the break room, at the photos of coworkers, families, at the schedule showing who was covering extra shifts to help pay for car repairs or medical bills or their kids' school supplies. This was my world, filled with people who understood that survival was a team sport, that we lifted each other up because none of us could make it alone. Marcus, do you remember Mrs. Chen, David's mother? He nodded, confused by the apparent change of subject. Last year, when she had surgery, I brought her dinner every night for 2 weeks, not because I expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Because when someone is hurting, you help if you can. I could see him trying to follow my logic. She never asked me to do it, never expected it. But when her son learned about it, he was grateful. Grateful enough to stand up for me in a restaurant full of strangers. That's how love works, Marcus. It's not a transaction. It's a choice you make every day. So you're saying there's hope? I reached across the table and took his hand. I'm saying that I've been making the choice to love you every day for 32 years, even when you made it difficult, even when you made it painful. The question is whether you're ready to start making that choice too. Marcus squeezed my hand, and for a moment I saw the little boy again, the one who used to crawl into my lap when the world felt too big and scary. I want to try, he said. I want to be the son you deserve. You want to be the man Victoria married, I corrected gently. Because that man is still in there somewhere. He just got lost for a while. We talked for another hour, until my lunch break was almost over and customers were starting to line up at the registers. But we'd made a start, created the foundation for something better. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in years I felt hope. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to me. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. That man last night, David Chen. When he stood up for you like that, how did it feel? I thought about it, remembering the moment when David had walked over to our table, when he'd spoken my name with such respect and recognition. It felt like being seen, I said finally. Really seen. Not as someone to be pitied or managed or fixed, but as someone with value. Someone worth defending. Marcus nodded slowly. I want to make you feel that way too. Not just once, but always. After he left, I returned to my register with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The afternoon flew by in a blur of familiar faces and routine transactions, but underneath it all was the steady pulse of hope. Change was possible. Healing was possible. Sometimes it just took a stranger's kindness to hold up a mirror and show you what you'd been missing. As I was preparing to close my register at the end of my shift, Mr. Martinez himself appeared at my elbow, something unusual enough to draw stares from my coworkers. Elena, can I see you in my office for a moment? My stomach dropped. Had someone complained about me taking too long with Marcus at lunch? Had I made a mistake with the register? In 8 years, I'd never been called to the office for anything serious. Mr. Martinez's office was cramped and cluttered, filled with invoices and vendor catalogs and photos of his grandchildren. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, then settled into his own chair with the careful movements of someone whose back had seen too many years of lifting and carrying. "Elena, I got a call today from David Chen." My heart started beating faster. "Oh?" "He owns that fancy restaurant downtown Lumière. You know the one." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "He told me what happened last night, about how your son was treating you, and how he stepped in." Mr. Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "He also told me about all the things you've done for his family. For his mother, for his daughter." I felt my cheeks burning. "Mr. Martinez, I hope this doesn't affect my job here. My personal life shouldn't interfere with work." He held up a hand, smiling. "Elena, you've been with us for 8 years. In that time, you've never been late, never called in sick unless you absolutely had to, never given me a moment's trouble. You're kind to difficult customers, you help your coworkers without being asked, and half the neighborhood asks specifically for you when they need help finding something." I wasn't sure where this was going, but I didn't interrupt. "David Chen called me because he wanted to know what kind of person you were at work. He's thinking about expanding his restaurant business, maybe opening something more casual, more neighborhood-focused. He wanted to know if you might be interested in managing it." The words hit me like lightning. Managing a restaurant? Me? I told him the truth, Mr. Martinez continued, that losing you would be a blow to this store, but that you deserve every opportunity that comes your way. "You've got the skills, Elena. You understand customer service. You know how to manage inventory. You work well under pressure. Most importantly, you care about people." I stared at him, speechless. "Now, I'm not saying you have to take it if he offers. You've got a home here for as long as you want it. But Elena, sometimes life gives you chances to grow, and I'd hate to see you pass one up out of fear." The conversation felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, not to grocery store clerks who lived in studio apartments and counted every dollar. "Mr. Martinez, I don't know what to say." He smiled, the same warm expression I'd seen him give his grandchildren when they visited the store. "Say you'll think about it. David's going to call you tomorrow to discuss the details. Whatever you decide, you have my support." I walked home that evening in a daze, my mind spinning with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. A management position? At a restaurant owned by someone who respected me, who saw value in what I brought to the table? My phone rang as I was unlocking my apartment door. Marcus's name on the screen. "Mom, I just wanted to call and see how the rest of your day went." It was such a simple gesture, but it meant everything. When was the last time Marcus had called just to check on me? "It was interesting," I said, settling into my chair by the window. "Very interesting." I told him about David Chen's call to Mr. Martinez, about the potential job opportunity, about the conversation in Mr. Martinez's office. Marcus listened without interrupting, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he responded. "Mom, that's incredible. You'd be amazing at managing a restaurant." "You think so?" "I know so. You've been managing people and situations your whole life. You turned me into a halfway decent human being, didn't you?" I laughed despite myself. Jury's still out on that one. "Fair enough. But seriously, Mom, this sounds like an amazing opportunity. Are you going to take it?" "I don't even know what it is yet." David hasn't called with details. "But if it's a good offer, you're considering it?" I looked around my small apartment, at the life I'd built through careful saving and countless small sacrifices. It was a good life, a stable life, but maybe it didn't have to be the only life. "I'm considering it," I said. "Good. You deserve good things, Mom. You deserve opportunities and recognition and all the things you've given other people for years." After we hung up, I sat by my window watching the sunset over the neighborhood I'd called home for so many years. Tomorrow, David Chen would call with details about a job I'd never imagined myself qualified for. Tomorrow, I might have decisions to make that could change the course of my life. But tonight, I had something even more precious. I had a son who was remembering how to love me, a community that valued what I brought to it, and a future that suddenly held possibilities I'd never dared to dream. Sometimes the most important changes start with a stranger's kindness in a crowded restaurant. Sometimes they begin with the courage to defend someone's dignity when it's under attack. And sometimes they grow from the simple recognition that every person has value, regardless of their bank account or their job title or their ability to afford the fancy places. As I prepared for bed, I thought about Sophia Chen and the photo she'd given me, about the little girl in the picture who'd felt so special just because someone paid attention to her. Maybe that was the real lesson from last night. Maybe dignity wasn't something you earned or bought or demanded. Maybe it was something you gave and received, freely and generously, one small moment of recognition at a time. I fell asleep thinking about possibilities, about second chances and new beginnings, about the unexpected ways life could surprise you just when you thought you knew how the story would end. David Chen called the next morning at precisely 9 o'clock, his voice warm but professional over the phone. I was sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, having arrived at work early, only to be sent home by Mr. Martinez, with instructions to take the call somewhere private. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all, Mr. Chen, thank you for calling." There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I'll get straight to the point. I've been planning to open a second location, something different from Lumière. More casual, more community-focused. A place where families can come for good food without the formality of fine dining." My heart started beating faster, but I forced myself to listen calmly. "After seeing how you handled yourself the other night, and after speaking with Mr. Martinez about your work ethic and character, I'd like to offer you the position of general manager." General manager. The words felt foreign in my mouth when I tried to repeat them silently. The salary would be $65,000 annually, plus benefits and profit sharing. The location would be about 10 minutes from where you live now, in the space that used to be Corelli's Deli on Maple Street. I knew the space well. I'd bought sandwiches there for years before Mr. Corelli retired. It was a good location, visible from the street, with parking and foot traffic from the nearby office buildings. "I realize this is a significant change from what you're doing now," David continued, "but I believe you have exactly the skills we need. You understand customer service, you know how to work with diverse groups of people, and most importantly, you care about making people feel welcome and valued." I found my voice finally. "Mr. Chen, I'm honored that you'd consider me, but I have to ask, why me? Surely there are people with more restaurant experience." His chuckle was warm. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I've been in this business for 15 years. I've hired managers with impressive resumes who treated customers like inconveniences and staff like servants. Experience managing a restaurant can be taught. Character cannot." We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, timelines, and expectations. The restaurant would open in 3 months, giving me time to work with the design team, hire and train staff, and develop systems. It felt overwhelming and exciting at the same time. "I don't need an answer immediately," David said as we prepared to hang up. "Take the weekend to think about it. But Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope you'll say yes. I think this could be the beginning of something wonderful." After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen staring at the notepad where I'd scribbled salary figures and opening dates. $65,000. More money than I'd ever made in my life. Enough to move to a bigger apartment. To stop worrying about every grocery bill. To maybe even take a vacation someday. But more than the money, it was the opportunity itself that took my breath away. Someone believed I was capable of running a business, of making important decisions, of leading a team. At 62, I was being offered a chance to reinvent myself professionally. The phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. Marcus's name on the screen. "Mom, how did the call go?" I filled him in on the details, and I could hear the excitement in his voice growing with each piece of information I shared. "Mom, this is incredible. You have to take it." "I don't know, Marcus. It's a big risk. What if I'm not good at it? What if I fail?" "What if you succeed?" he countered. "Mom, what's the worst that could happen? You try something new and it doesn't work out? You could always go back to Martinez Market. But what if it does work? What if you're amazing at this?" His confidence in me was unexpected and touching. When was the last time Marcus had encouraged me to take a risk, to reach for something bigger? I'm scared, I admitted. Good, he said firmly. That means it matters. That means it's worth doing. We talked for a few more minutes before he had to go to a meeting, but his words stayed with me throughout the day. What if you succeed? That evening, I called Victoria. It was the first time I'd initiated contact with her in years, usually leaving communication to flow through Marcus. She sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me. Elena, Marcus told me about the job offer. How exciting! Victoria, can I ask you something? Of course. When you started your marketing career, were you scared? Did you doubt whether you belonged in those boardrooms? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Every day for the first 2 years, she said finally. I was convinced someone would figure out I didn't know what I was doing and ask me to leave. How did you get through it? I realized that feeling like an imposter was normal, that even the people who seemed confident were making it up as they went along. The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't confidence. It's willingness to show up and do the work even when you're terrified. Her words resonated deeply. I'd been showing up and doing the work my entire life, just in different contexts. Elena, can I tell you something? Yes. Marcus has talked about you differently since dinner the other night. There's pride in his voice when he mentions you. Real pride. Not the performative kind he used to use when he was trying to impress people. Whatever happened in that restaurant changed something in him. After we hung up, I walked to my window and looked out at the street where I'd lived for so many years. Mrs. Chen was watering her small garden, moving carefully but steadily. Mr. Kowalski was returning from his evening walk, nodding to neighbors as he passed. This was my community, these were my people. Would I be abandoning them by taking this opportunity? The next morning, I woke with unusual clarity. I dressed carefully and walked to Martinez Market, not for my shift, but to have a conversation I'd been avoiding. Mr. Martinez was in the produce section, examining a shipment of tomatoes with the intensity of a jeweler appraising diamonds. He looked up when I approached, his weathered face breaking into a smile. Elena, good morning. Have you thought about David Chen's offer? I have. And I think I want to take it. He nodded slowly. I thought you might. It's a good opportunity. But I feel guilty about leaving. You've been good to me, and this store, these customers, they're like family. Mr. Martinez set down the tomato he'd been examining and looked at me directly. Elena, do you know why I called you into my office yesterday? I shook my head. Because in 8 years, I've never seen you put yourself first. Not once. You've covered shifts for sick coworkers. You've stayed late to help with inventory. You've gone above and beyond for customers who probably never even knew your name. It's time for someone to put you first. His words hit harder than I'd expected. But what about the store? What about my regular customers? The store will survive. It survived before you came, and it will survive after you leave. But Elena, this chance might not come again. You're 62. How many more opportunities like this do you think you'll get? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with truth. Take the job, he said gently. Take it and succeed brilliantly. Show everyone what I've known for years, that you're capable of extraordinary things. I gave my notice that afternoon, agreeing to work for 2 more weeks while Mr. Martinez found and trained my replacement. Word spread quickly through the store, and I was surprised by the reactions of my coworkers and regular customers. Mrs. Patterson hugged me with tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, dear. You're going to do wonderful things. James, the young cashier who'd been saving money for college, shook my hand formally. Mrs. Rodriguez, you taught me that treating customers with respect wasn't just about being polite. It was about seeing people as human beings. I won't forget that. Even Sophia Chen stopped by, having heard the news from her father. Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't wait to eat at your restaurant. My dad says it's going to be the best place in the neighborhood. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of training my replacement, organizing my few belongings at work, and beginning to prepare for a future I was still struggling to fully imagine. David Chen had arranged for me to spend time at Lumière, learning about restaurant operations from the ground up. It was intimidating at first, being surrounded by servers and cooks who moved with practiced efficiency. But gradually I began to see how all the pieces fit together. The chef, Maria Santos, took me under her wing with surprising generosity. "David told me about your background," she said as we reviewed inventory procedures. "Customer service, attention to detail, managing multiple priorities under pressure. You've been training for this job your whole life. You just didn't know it." Marcus visited me at home twice during those 2 weeks, something that hadn't happened in years. The conversations were different now, easier somehow. He asked about my day, listened to my concerns about the new job, shared stories about his own work that weren't designed to impress or diminish but simply to connect. "I've been thinking," he said during his second visit, "about what you said at the store, about survival being a team sport." I looked up from the restaurant management books David had given me to study. I realized I've been playing as if it was every person for themselves. As if your struggles were something to escape from rather than something we went through together. "Marcus, you were a child. Children shouldn't have to worry about adult problems." He shook his head. "But I wasn't a child when I started treating you badly. I was an adult who should have known better. An adult who should have been grateful instead of ashamed." The conversation led to places we'd never been able to go before, to admissions and apologies that had been years in the making. By the time he left that evening, something had shifted between us. Some long-standing wall had finally crumbled. On my last day at Martinez Market, the staff threw a small farewell party in the break room. There was cake from the bakery section, and flowers from the floral department, and speeches that made me cry in the best possible way. Mr. Martinez presented me with a small plaque that read, "Elena Rodriguez, 8 years of excellence, a lifetime of character. Keep this in your new office," he said with a grin, "to remember where you came from and what you're made of." The night before I was scheduled to start my new position, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with excitement and terror in equal measure. Tomorrow I would walk into a space that would become my responsibility, my domain. I would make decisions that affected other people's livelihoods, create systems that would determine whether customers felt welcomed or dismissed. At some point during the long night, I got up and pulled out the photo Sophia had given me, the one from the community center holiday party. Looking at it, I remembered David Chen's words about dignity coming from how you treat others. That little girl in the photo had felt special because someone had taken the time to pay attention to her, to make her feel valued. That was what I wanted to create in the new restaurant. Not just good food or efficient service, but a place where people felt seen and appreciated. A place where families could celebrate special occasions without feeling judged, where teenagers could afford to take their dates, where elderly customers could linger over coffee without being rushed. I thought about Marcus, about the transformation I'd witnessed in him over the past few weeks. People could change. Relationships could heal. Second chances were possible, even when it seemed like too much damage had been done. The morning of my first day, I dressed carefully in the professional clothes Victoria had helped me select during a shopping trip that had felt like a small miracle in itself. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I looked like someone who belonged in a management office, someone with authority and purpose. The restaurant's space was empty when I arrived, filled with the potential of what it could become. David Chen was already there, reviewing architectural plans with a woman I didn't recognize. "Elena, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Sarah Kim, our interior designer." "Sarah, this is Elena Rodriguez, our new general manager." Sarah shook my hand warmly. "I'm so excited to work with you. David's told me about his vision for this place, and I think we're going to create something really special." We spent the morning walking through the space, discussing layouts and color schemes, and the flow of service. My input was not only welcomed but actively sought. My opinions about customer comfort and staff efficiency given equal weight with design aesthetics and cost considerations. "What do you think about the seating arrangement?" Sarah asked, showing me sketches of the proposed floor plan. I studied the drawings, thinking about the customers I'd served over the years, the families I'd watched celebrate birthdays and anniversaries. the elderly couples who needed extra time to decide what to order. Could we have a few tables with longer benches instead of individual chairs? For families with small children who need to move around. And maybe some tables positioned so servers don't have to reach over customers to serve food? Both Sarah and David nodded enthusiastically, and I realized with a start that my suggestions weren't just being humored, they were being implemented. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the work with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I interviewed potential employees, worked with vendors to establish supply relationships, and collaborated with Maria to develop a menu that was sophisticated enough to justify good prices but accessible enough to welcome everyone. The hiring process revealed how much I'd learned from years of customer service. I could spot applicants who would treat customers with respect versus those who saw service work as beneath them. I could identify people who would work well as part of a team versus those who would create drama and conflict. Marcus stopped by one evening as I was reviewing applications at my kitchen table. "How's it going, boss?" he asked with a grin. The word boss startled me. I was a boss. I was someone who would make decisions, solve problems, lead a team. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "It's overwhelming," I admitted. "Good overwhelming, but still overwhelming." He sat across from me at the table, the same table where we'd had our difficult conversation weeks earlier. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. "Watching you do this, seeing you take this risk and embrace this opportunity, it's changed how I see you. But more than that, it's changed how I see myself." "What do you mean?" "I've been so focused on escaping where I came from that I forgot to be proud of it. You raised me to work hard, to treat people fairly, to never give up when things got tough. Those aren't things to be ashamed of. They're the foundation of everything good about who I am." The opening of the restaurant, which we'd decided to name Neighborhood Table, was scheduled for a Thursday evening in October. David had wanted to do a formal grand opening with local press and food critics, but I'd convinced him to start smaller, with a soft opening for friends and family. My first dinner service as a restaurant manager was everything I'd imagined and nothing I'd expected. The controlled chaos of a working kitchen, the dance of servers moving between tables, the satisfaction of watching customers' faces light up when they tasted their food for the first time. Mrs. Chen was among the first customers, accompanied by Sophia and what I assumed was Sophia's mother. They were seated at table 12, right in my line of sight from the host station where I'd positioned myself to oversee operations. Marcus arrived with Victoria, both of them dressed nicely but not formally, striking exactly the tone I'd hoped to achieve. They were followed by Mr. Martinez and his wife, by several of my former co-workers from the grocery store, by neighbors I'd known for years but had never socialized with outside of casual conversations. The evening wasn't perfect. The kitchen fell behind during the first rush, forcing me to personally deliver apologies and complimentary appetizers to tables that had been waiting too long. One server struggled with the point-of-sale system, requiring patient coaching during the busiest part of the night. A family with young children needed extra attention when their toddler knocked over a water glass. But every challenge felt manageable, every problem solvable. This was work I understood, just on a larger scale, and with higher stakes. Near the end of the evening, as the last customers were finishing their desserts, David Chen appeared at my elbow. "How does it feel?" I looked around the dining room, taking in the scene I'd helped create. Customers lingering over coffee, servers clearing tables with efficient grace, the warm hum of satisfied conversation filling the space. "It feels like home," I said. 6 months later, Neighborhood Table had become exactly what I'd envisioned. A place where celebration and comfort coexisted, where excellent food was served without pretension, where every customer was treated like family. We'd been reviewed by the local newspaper, featured in a neighborhood magazine, and recommended by word of mouth throughout the community. But the real measure of success wasn't in the reviews or the revenue. It was in the elderly couple who came in every Tuesday for lunch, in the teenager who'd gotten his first job as a busboy and was saving money for college, in the birthday parties and anniversary dinners and casual family meals that filled our tables every night. Marcus had become a regular customer, bringing Victoria for dinner at least once a week. He'd also begun bringing colleagues, introducing me with visible pride as my mother, the restaurant manager. The shift in his language, from embarrassment to ownership to genuine respect, marked a transformation that went deeper than just our relationship. Standing in my restaurant office late one evening, reviewing the day's receipts and planning the next day's specials, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From a grocery store clerk counting register receipts, to a restaurant manager planning menus and managing staff. From a woman whose own son was ashamed of her, to someone whose accomplishments were celebrated by her community. The photo Sophia had given me sat on my desk, a reminder of where I'd come from and who I'd always been. But now it was joined by other photos. The staff at our opening night, Marcus and Victoria at their anniversary dinner, Mrs. Chen teaching Sophia to fold napkins during a slow afternoon. This was what dignity looked like, I realized. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of respect. Not perfection, but growth. Not a destination, but a way of traveling through life with purpose and grace. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Marcus's voice, warm and familiar. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to see how service went tonight. Just wanted to check on me. Just wanted to connect. Just wanted to be a good son," to a mother he'd learned to see clearly. "It was perfect," I said, and meant it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.